There is a moment described in several Japanese military records from the Sengoku period that tends to confuse modern readers. A column of several thousand soldiers, armed, moving through mountain terrain, passes through a village at dawn and makes almost no sound. No shouting, no singing, no drums except for the occasional muffled beat of a signal instrument at the column's rear. Villagers watching from behind wooden shutters later recalled not the noise of the army, but the silence of it. The creak of lacquered armor, the soft rhythm of straw sandals on packed earth, the controlled breathing of men who had been taught, deliberately, that an army's discipline could be measured by what it did not say. That image tends to feel strange to people raised on a different idea of military spectacle. Most of us associate large armies with noise, the roar of troops, the clatter of equipment, the call and response of marching cadence. Western military traditions, particularly from ancient Rome through the Napoleonic era, often used sound as a tool of cohesion and psychological projection. Armies sang, chanted, drummed, and shouted. The noise was the point. It unified men, it announced dominance, it made the soldiers themselves feel like part of something powerful. The samurai tradition, particularly during the period stretching from the late Heian era through the wars of the 16th century, operated from a different set of assumptions. The silence that observers noted wasn't accidental, and it wasn't purely spiritual. It was the result of a set of interlocking military, social, and psychological systems that made noise a liability and discipline a survival mechanism. Understanding why requires getting close to what Japanese armies actually were, their structure, their logistics, their terrain, and the nature of their enemies. The word samurai carries enormous cultural weight in the modern world, most of it shaped by film, fiction, and retrospective mythology. In practice, a samurai force moving through the Japanese countryside during the Sengoku period, the era of warring states, roughly spanning the 15th and 16th centuries, was not a small band of elegant swordsmen. It was a complex, tiered military organization, and the mounted warrior elite formed only the visible top layer of it. Beneath the samurai cavalry and senior foot soldiers was a large body of ashigaru, foot troops drawn largely from farming communities who carried spears, bows, and later firearms. Below them came the porters, the supply handlers, the cooks, the horse grooms, the water bearers. A significant military column moving through mountain passes or rice paddy networks might consist of several thousand people, the majority of whom had no formal military training at all. They were laborers keeping an army moving. What made this column function as a military instrument rather than a mob was hierarchy enforced through silence. The practical reality of controlling several thousand people across broken terrain, much of it forested mountain country with narrow trails, meant that communication had to be precise and transmitted only when necessary. A large group of people generating constant noise, conversation, complaints, arguments, the ordinary chatter of humans in close proximity, becomes operationally very difficult to command. Signals get lost, warnings fail to reach the column's rear, flankers can't hear repositioning orders. In terrain where a wrong turn could mean an entire unit walking into a defile with no exit, the ability to hear a single instrument signal or a whispered order relayed back through the column was a genuine tactical asset. This wasn't mysticism, it was acoustics and command logic. The terrain of the Japanese archipelago shaped nearly everything about how its armies moved and fought. Unlike the broad plains of continental Europe or the open steppes of Central Asia, Japan's interior is predominantly mountainous. Even today, roughly 70% of Japan's land area is covered by forested mountain terrain. During the Sengoku period, when armies had to move entirely on foot or horseback along trails that had barely changed since the Nara era, that landscape imposed severe constraints. A column moving through a mountain valley in late autumn was dealing with cold that could settle into single digits overnight, fog that reduced visibility to a few dozen meters in the early morning, trails that narrowed to the width of two men walking abreast, and surfaces of wet leaves over compacted earth that made footing genuinely treacherous under the weight of armor. And full set of oyori armor could weigh upwards of 60 pounds, depending on its construction. Men wearing it over 15 or 20 miles of mountain trail, carrying a spear in addition to their personal weapons, were already under significant physical strain before any engagement began. In that context, the order to maintain silence was also an order to conserve energy. Sustained conversation while marching under load is physically costly. The respiratory effort alone, speaking requires controlling the breath, which competes directly with the breathing needed for sustained physical effort, is measurably draining over distance. Experienced commanders understood this not in physiological terms as we would frame it, but empirically through years of observation. Men who talked less arrived less exhausted. Men who arrived less exhausted fought better. The silence of the march was, among other things, a stamina management system.
There was a second dimension to it, more immediately tactical. Japanese armies during the Sengoku period operated in a landscape with good acoustic properties. Sound carries well in mountain valleys. A column moving through forested terrain could hear distant sounds clearly. The bark of a dog in a village 2 miles ahead, the creak of wooden structures across a ridgeline, the faint metallic sound of armored men repositioning in the tree line. Conversely, a noisy column broadcast its own position, its approximate size, and its direction of travel to anyone within earshot, long before visual contact was possible. Ambush was a standard feature of Sengoku warfare. The passes and valleys of central Honshu saw ambushes of varying scale throughout the period, ranging from small raids by local brigands on supply convoys to carefully coordinated tactical ambushes by opposing daimyo forces designed to neutralize an advancing column before it could deploy. The historical records from several major campaigns, including operations conducted by Oda Nobunaga in the 1570s and Takeda Shingen's movements through the Shinano region, describe extensive scouting networks designed specifically to gather acoustic intelligence about opposing forces before visual contact. A silent column was a harder target to locate. It was also a harder column to read. Noise allows an observer to estimate column length, equipment weight, and troop composition. Silence denies all of that. An army that moves quietly forces its opponents to expose themselves in order to gather intelligence, because passive listening yields very little information about a silent column beyond its approximate position. There is also the matter of ambush in reverse. A silent column moving through mountain terrain could hear an enemy position before the enemy heard them approaching, allowing for repositioning, flanking, or the simple tactical advantage of choosing the moment of engagement. In terrain where every valley created a natural acoustic tunnel, sound discipline was the equivalent of tactical camouflage. The discipline that produced this silence did not emerge spontaneously. It was trained, enforced, and culturally embedded in ways that made it function even under the stress of combat operations. Japanese military culture of the period operated through a strict vertical hierarchy. The relationship between a senior samurai and his subordinates was structured through social obligation and shame in ways that extended across family lineages. A soldier who broke march discipline did not merely risk punishment from his immediate commander. He risked dishonoring the unit, the lord, and his own family name. In a society where a family's reputation affected marriage prospects, land rights, and access to patronage, shame was a genuine behavioral regulator, not a metaphor for one. This meant the enforcement of march silence did not require constant supervision. Soldiers enforced it on each other. A man who started talking unnecessarily would receive immediate social pressure from the men around him before any officer became involved. The silence was self-sustaining because the entire system around it made violations costly at the personal level, not just the institutional one. The Ashigaru, the foot soldiers who formed the backbone of most Sengoku armies, were integrated into this system gradually through training that began with basic physical conditioning and included extensive drilling in formation movement, signal response, and positional discipline. Surviving training manuals and military texts from the period, including portions of documents associated with major daimyo households, describe the drilling of Ashigaru in controlled movement exercises, where the ability to execute a pivot or advance on signal without verbal communication was considered a basic competency. Silence in movement was not an advanced skill, it was a foundational one. The signals that replaced spoken communication were varied, highly specific, and had to be learned and retained under stress. Japanese armies of the period used a combination of auditory and visual signals to communicate across the column and between units. Drums, taiko, provided the primary auditory communication channel. Different rhythmic patterns communicated advance, halt, retreat, and various tactical repositioning orders. The specific patterns varied by domain, which meant that the signals used by Oda forces would not be immediately legible to Tokugawa soldiers, providing a rudimentary form of signal security. Conch shells, known as horagai, served a similar function at longer ranges and in noisier environments, since the horn's lower frequency penetrated ambient sound better in certain terrain configurations. Flags and fans provided visual communication for shorter ranges and for commands that needed to be directional, indicating not just advance, but advance on the left flank. The role of the signal system in maintaining march silence is crucial. In a modern military context, we might assume that march silence requires that all communications cease. The reality was the opposite. March silence required that all casual, informal communication be suppressed, precisely so that formal signal communication could be heard and acted upon reliably. The silence was not the absence of communication, it was the precondition for communication to work. Men who were trained to listen for drum patterns, who knew that a specific beat sequence meant halt in place, and another meant deploy right, could only exercise that skill if they were not generating ambient noise that would mask or delay their recognition of the signal. The silence enforced the signal, and the signal enforced the silence. Each made the other function. There's a psychological dimension here that deserves careful framing because it tends to get romanticized into something it probably was not in daily practice.
Later philosophical writing, particularly texts associated with what became codified as Bushido in the Edo period, would frame the warrior's silence in explicitly spiritual terms: the conquest of the undisciplined mind, the cultivation of mu, the state of mental emptiness that was held to be the foundation of effective action. Some of this framing was genuine, in the sense that the religious and philosophical currents running through Japanese warrior culture, particularly Zen Buddhism, which had deep roots in samurai practice from the Kamakura period onward, genuinely influenced how warriors conceptualized their inner state during combat and its preparation. But the day-to-day reality of a Sengoku army on the march was not primarily a meditation exercise. The men walking those mountain trails were dealing with blistered feet inside straw sandals, the particular misery of lacquered armor that had absorbed a night's rain and now sat cold and damp against their shoulders, hunger managed through small meals of dried rice and pickled vegetables eaten at brief rest stops, and the ordinary anxiety of men who knew they were moving toward a place where some of them would not survive. The silence that characterized those columns was produced by training, hierarchy, threat of shame, and tactical necessity. The spiritual framing that later tradition attached to it was real but secondary, a layer of meaning added to a practice that existed for reasons that were, at their core, operational. That framing made the discipline easier to maintain and gave soldiers a more elevating way to think about what was, practically speaking, a difficult requirement. But the requirement came first. It is worth looking briefly at how this approach compared with contemporary military practice elsewhere, not to rank civilizations, but to sharpen understanding of what was distinctive about the Japanese approach. European armies of the equivalent period operated with far more ambient noise during movement. Swiss pike columns were known for their discipline, but that discipline expressed itself in tight formation geometry, not acoustic suppression. Ottoman armies on campaign were, by most accounts, deliberately loud. The janissary bands that accompanied military columns were designed to project power through sound, not deny it to listeners. The Japanese emphasis on acoustic discipline appears to have been unusually systematic, shaped by a combination of specific factors: the terrain of the archipelago, the central role of ambush in Sengoku tactical culture, and the shame-based social mechanisms that made sustained discipline across large mixed formations achievable in ways that might have been difficult elsewhere. The silence that characterized those columns was produced by training, hierarchy, threat of shame, and tactical necessity. The spiritual framing that later tradition attached to it was real but secondary, a layer of meaning added to a practice that existed for reasons that were, at their core, operational. That framing made the discipline easier to maintain and gave soldiers a more elevating way to think about what was, practically speaking, a difficult requirement. But the requirement came first. By the time the Sengoku period closed and Japan entered the long domestic peace of the Edo era under Tokugawa rule, the practical military necessity of march discipline began to shift in character. Armies were no longer moving through hostile mountain terrain toward active enemies. The drills and formations were maintained, but increasingly as ceremony rather than operational preparation. What happened during the Edo period is that march discipline was gradually reinterpreted through a philosophical lens. The silence of the warrior became a virtue in itself, abstracted from its tactical origins and elevated into a statement about character. A man who was silent had mastered himself. The quiet of the march became the outward expression of an inner ideal. This is how practical military discipline becomes cultural mythology. The silence of a Sengoku column moving through autumn fog was not poetry, it was operational necessity, enforced by social pressure and trained into men who understood, at a practical level, that the wrong sound at the wrong moment could mean the end of their lord's campaign, their unit's cohesion, and their own lives. That it became poetry over time is interesting in its own right, but the poem was written later. The march came first. If you found this examination of samurai military practice worth your time, the next question worth asking might be closer than you expect. What else did these men do in silence that we've since turned into legend?